Hi, we're out on the range today, so please bear with gunfire you hear in the background. Recently, a viewer sent me some ammunition and asked me to test it, so here we are. And what we're shooting today is Winchester Ranger T-Series 9x19 147 grain jacketed hollow point. Now, as far as 9mm ammo goes, there's a wide variety of projectile weights, but what is most common is a 115 or a 124. So 147 is pretty heavy by 9mm standards. And the question is, why would you select a bullet that heavy? Well, there's lots of reasons, but the two main ones are the belief that the heavier projectile will have more energy foot-pounds. There's also the thought that regardless of energy foot-pounds, the heavier projectile will retain that energy better than a light projectile will, thus giving you better penetration on the intended target. Now, the big question here is, will it really do those things? Well, we'll see if we can answer that. There's also the factor that as 9mm 147 grain loads go, is the Winchester Ranger T-Series really a good one? Well, we'll see if we can shed some light on that too. So let's shoot a few different targets with a few different types of 9mm ammo and see what we can learn. Now, I'm going to start with shooting several different types of 9mm ammo, both 147 and 115 grain projectiles, through our chronograph. We'll check the velocities and compute the energy foot-pounds and see how they compare. A lot of people have asked about the chronograph. I can't really explain the physics of it, but basically the way it works is you shoot through these two sensors, and the chronograph can tell the time it takes to get from the front to the rear sensor, translates that into feet per second, and I read it off the LED display on the front. A lot of people have asked, how can I read the numbers off this at the distance of 7 yards? Actually, the numbers are about an inch high, and they're pretty easy to see at that distance. Now, today I'm not going to make you sit through the tedious process of watching me shoot the chronograph. I'll just shoot the ammunition, crunch the numbers, and then let's take a look at the results. Our test gun today was a Beretta Model 92 FS, and we've shot through our chronograph and crunched all the numbers, and here they are. Now, these upper three are 147 grain projectiles, and the lower two are 115 grain projectiles, which give us significantly more velocity. But how does that translate into energy foot-pounds? Well, if I did my math right, our Ranger T gave us 314, but just our regular Winchester White Box 147 gave us 328. Our Remington Gold and Saber gave us 345. But how does that compare with just the 115 grain projectiles? With our Winchester White Box we get 334, and with our Remington Green and White Box we get 324. So the idea that the heavier projectile is going to give us greater energy foot-pounds, that's not always the case, and even when it was the case, the amount more we got was negligible. Now, the idea of a greater bullet weight giving us greater energy foot-pounds is true very often in traditional rifle calibers, 30-30, 308, 30-06, but in handgun calibers, we see that quite often the opposite is true, and even when we get more energy foot-pounds, it isn't much. But what about the idea of the heavier projectile being able to retain that energy more, so more penetration through the intended target and maybe more penetration through a barrier? Let's see if we can put that to the test. These are the $2 concrete blocks, and I'll go back 10 yards and I'll shoot the one on your left with Winchester White Box 115 grain jacketed hollow point, and then the one on your right with Winchester White Box 147 grain jacketed hollow point. And let's see if there's a difference in effect. So with the 115 grain projectiles, I fired 14 shots, and with the 147 grain projectiles, I only fired 11. So is the heavier bullet more effective? You be the judge. Now, what about penetration of the 147 grain projectiles through the intended target? To test that, we use the meat target. Now, for those who haven't seen it before, it's leather jacket skin followed by pork chop pectoral, pork ribs, a bag of oranges lung tissue, more pork ribs on the back, 4 layers of t-shirt on the front, 4 layers on the back, and the whole thing followed by the new and improved high-tech fleece bullet stop. When I shoot this kind of target, no matter what caliber I'm using, if I'm using hollow point projectiles, the most common result is 100% penetration through the target, and then the bullets are stopped by the 1st to 5th layer of fleece. So how will we know if the 147 grain projectiles are going to give us more penetration than the lighter bullets will? Because this is a magnum meat target. That means instead of 1 layer of leather jacket skin, it has 2. I've also added some margarine fat layer to simulate that fat that we all claim we don't have. Now hopefully you don't have this much fat in front of your pectoral, but we know some people do. So I'm going to shoot from 10 yards with our Winchester Ranger T-Series 147 grain hollow point, and we'll see what kind of penetration we get. There's also one other factor. We know that hollow point bullets are velocity based. The faster you propel them, the more expansion you're going to get, up to a point. And we saw that these 147 grain projectiles have significantly lower velocities than the 115 grain projectiles did. So what kind of expansion are we going to have? Well, we'll find out in a minute. Well, I've got the meat target taken apart. First, let me show you a close-up of the projectiles. Now, one of the projectiles fell out on the ground and I couldn't find it, but here's 4 of the 5, and we see good expansion in one of them, and that one was stopped by the t-shirt on the back of the target. In the others, we see mediocre down to 0 expansion. Although I see penetration up to about the 10th layer of fleece, the damage to the meat target is on par with full metal jacket ammunition. So the Ranger T-Series ammo doesn't seem to be that impressive. Let me try a different type of 147 grain hollow point. Now we'll try just plain old Winchester white box 147 grain jacketed hollow point. And again, we'll shoot from 7 yards. Now with our Winchester white box ammo, it looks like we got a little more damage to the meat target, some tearing up of our orange lung tissue. We still had penetration to about the 8th or 10th layer of fleece, and the projectiles seem to have a little more expansion. Let me show you a close-up of them. And although this expansion is not what I'd call good, it does appear to be better than the Winchester Ranger T-Series. Now let's shoot from 7 yards with Winchester White Box 115 grain jacketed hollow point. All of our 115 grain projectiles were stopped by the 1st layer of fleece, but when I look at the damage they did to the orange lung tissue, it's extensively more, and our margarine fat layer has a lot more damage done to it. So it would appear that although we're not getting as much penetration with the 115s, we are doing a lot more damage to the intended target. Now let me show you a close-up of the projectiles. And we see the expansion with our 115s is significantly more. So is there a good 147 grain 9mm load? Well, let's try this Remington Golden Saber. Our Golden Saber 147 grain hollow points were all stopped by the 1st layer of fleece. But the damage they did to our margarine fat layer, to our pork chop pectoral, and to our orange lung tissue was significantly greater than the other 147s. Now let me show you a close-up of these projectiles. And we see relatively good expansion in these, and as Golden Sabers typically do, they all lost their jackets, which are stuck somewhere in the meat target. So what's the takeaway from all of this? Well, at the beginning we asked 2 main questions. 1, why would you choose 147 grain projectiles for your 9x19? And 2, is the Winchester Ranger T-Series a good choice among 147 grain projectiles? Well, the reason you would choose 147 grain is because you believe it has more energy than the lighter projectiles, or that it has more energy retention than the lighter projectiles, making for better penetration through barriers or better penetration through the intended target. Well, as far as more energy, we saw that that's true marginally sometimes. Better energy retention for better penetration through barriers, based on that concrete block test, I'd say there's some validity to that idea. But penetration through the intended target, we saw that it went through the meat target and then through several layers of fleece, more penetration than the 115s had. But I'd say that had more to do with a lack of expansion than greater energy retention. Now when we shot our 147 grains, we saw that the Remington Golden Saber, even though it had the highest velocity of anything I shot today, only penetrated through to the first layer of fleece, because it's the only 147 I shot today that had really pretty good expansion. Now, as far as whether or not the Ranger T series is a good choice among 147 grain 9mm loads, well, based on our numbers, it had the lowest velocity of any one I shot today, even being outdone by the Winchester white box. And as far as bullet expansion and damage to the meat target, it seemed to have the least, again being outdone by the Winchester white box, something that some people call the Pabst Blue Ribbon of ammunition. So is Ranger T-Series 9mm 147 grain a good choice? The only answer I'd give is to say that I don't plan on buying any of them. So, as always, don't try this at home on what you call a professional, and thanks for watching the 9mm 147 grain Winchester T-Series video.